It was just out of curiosity at first, as one of the residents of an apartment building on Gascon de Gotha No. 2 stepped out of their front door and into the main stairwell of the building. She looked up and down the stairs, expecting to see someone there, but there wasn't anyone. It was laughter she had heard from inside her apartment. Loud, hysterical, endless laughter. Soon she was joined by another resident, and then another. The laughter echoed around the halls. They began walking up and down the stairs, but it was odd. It seemed difficult to figure out where exactly it was coming from. It grew so frustrating that when the owner of the building stepped out onto the stairwell with his young son, he decided to contact the police. But of course, the police weren't exactly keen to come out and investigate a case of someone laughing too loudly. But regardless, before anything could be done, the laughter stopped. The building was plunged back into a strange, uneasy silence as the residents looked at one another. None of them knew that their simple apartment building was about to become the centre of attention for people all across Spain and the wider international community as well. Soon the police, government and even the army would be on their doorstep trying to figure out what was going on. This was, in fact, the beginning of one of the most widely witnessed supposed paranormal instances of all time. Get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. I've got a truly unusual paranormal case to explore tonight, and a chance for me to butcher the Spanish language. The newspapers would call it El Duende de Zaragoza. Roughly translated, it is now known as the Goblin of Zaragoza. Welcome to the Tape Library. Before we get into this one properly, I want to take a moment to thank my long-time sponsor, Manta Sleep. Manta Sleep specialises in making high-quality sleep masks, and I've discussed them on this channel a bunch of times and used them myself for a few years now. But they also have other sleep-related products, from earplugs to the item I've been using over the last month, their white noise machine. I don't think I need to explain the benefits of a white noise machine for sleep, but they are a game changer for disguising those little noises you might hear in the night that can keep you awake, be they demons, ghosts, or just a busy road nearby. The Manta Sleep white noise machine has 15 different sound options to choose from, and they are all non-looping, so you don't get distracted by noticing repeating tones. It has a remote control and sleep timer if you need it, so I keep the speaker on the other side of the room, but have control over it from the comfort of my bed. My favourite part of this though is the booster speaker, so you can have a second speaker on the other end of the room. The pair sync up and it just kind of creates this wall of gentle 360 sound around you. I love it, and if you want 10% off one for yourself, or any other Manta Sleep products, then use the link in the description, or the code TAPE at checkout. Thank you once again, Manta Sleep. And now, let's get into the story of the Goblin of Zaragoza. Spain in 1934 was a place on the brink. Only a few years earlier the monarchy had fallen, and the Second Spanish Republic had been declared, ushering in rapid social and political change. But the optimism of this new era was already beginning to fracture. Strikes, protests and violent clashes between opposing political groups were becoming increasingly common, and newspapers were filled with stories of unrest and instability. The future felt unpredictable, as though the country was holding its breath, waiting for something serious to happen. In times like this, the unexplained takes on a different weight. When everyday life feels fragile, strange stories travel faster and feel more believable. So when reports began to spread of a mysterious voice speaking from a kitchen stove in Zaragoza, the country was already primed to listen, ready to wonder whether the world around them was becoming stranger in more ways than one. It had begun with that laughter, a strange cackling laugh felt throughout an apartment building in Zaragoza. But when it suddenly stopped, the residents went back to their daily routines. However, one household in the building was not so lucky. This is where the Palazon family lived. It was late the following morning when their maid, Pasquala Alcocer, headed into the kitchen to begin cooking a meal. The building had been abuzz with murmurs about the strange laughter the night before, but the young maid who hadn't heard it paid it no mind. She lit the old wood stove in the family's kitchen and then began her prep work, when she heard someone speak. "No, you're hurting me," they moaned in a long, drawn-out way. Pasquala glanced around the kitchen. She was alone. The rest of the family was in the other room. She felt uneasy and tried to carry on what she was doing, but a part of her was convinced it had come from the direction of the stove. Pasquala bent down to put out the fire. As soon as she did, the voice was heard again. "Light," it cried. "Light. I cannot see." Pasquala screamed and ran out of the kitchen. The first instinct from the family was that someone was somehow trapped in the chimney. It ran from the stove up through multiple apartments before reaching the roof. But they checked the stove first, calling out to see if anyone would respond, before then checking the vents in the roof. There wasn't any sign of a person trapped in there, and it seemed like it would be much too small for someone to have got in there anyway. Then they began to suspect that it was simply someone playing a joke. Someone in another apartment who clearly figured out a way to make their voice echo through the chimney. This would also explain the laughter from the day before. But no one would admit to it. The family knocked on multiple neighbours' doors, and they all seemed as baffled as they did. There certainly was something going on though. Banging and scratching sounds would be heard in the apartment. It was at times a little unclear if it was coming from the stove or from the walls themselves, but these sounds were often accompanied by a voice. Sometimes it just laughed or moaned. Other times it would speak. It was a man's voice, but at first it seemed to sound slightly light and feminine, almost like a child. As time passed, however, it quickly took on a deeper, more gravelly tone. The family would hear it, mumbling to itself at night. When they would try to speak to it, it would respond in an almost mocking tone, laughing and teasing them. Quickly, the rumours about what was going on spread throughout the building, and various neighbours came knocking on the family's door, keen to hear the voice for themselves. And the voice always seemed happy to give them what they wanted, interacting with people if they spoke directly to it, sometimes playfully, other times more aggressive. It often seemed to be demanding light, as though it literally were just sitting there in the darkness of the stove or chimney, but no one could see anything inside. This gave a sense that this wasn't a disembodied voice, or in anyone's head. It was something in the dark, something they couldn't see. Interestingly, as a result of this detail, the family and the other residents didn't jump to the idea that this was some sort of ghost. They instead referred to it as a duende, which can be translated to an elf, gnome, or, most commonly in the context of this story, a goblin. There are numerous different entities that could be referred to as a duende, but the actual word is most commonly associated with the phrase dueño de casa, or master of the house, which is an interesting distinction to make, because the duende is presented here as a household entity, not a creature you might find hiding out in the woods. It does almost feel closer to a ghost than it would a more fairy-like creature that I think most people would associate with the folklore of a goblin. They are seen as mostly harmless, but mischievous entities that cause trouble in people's homes. Whoever the voice belonged to, it seemed to want attention, to cause disruption. The family and others in the building would be woken up in the middle of the night by pained screams that would echo from the chimney. At times it would call out for someone named Maria, asking her to come to it, but a lot of its messages seemed to be aimed at the maid, Pasquala, who it seemed to fixate on, often just shouting out her name, before breaking into a maniacal laugh that chilled the young girl to the bone. It kept demanding that she come to the stove, to come closer to the darkness inside. But it would never reveal who or what it was, not even to her. The residents later described the voice as intelligent, even witty, but prone to anger, delivering threats and seemingly pointless demands as well. Many in the building believed it to be simply a prank, but no one was able to find the culprit. By mid-November, unable to find a compelling explanation, the Palazon family contacted the police. It's very likely that the police would have ignored a claim of a goblin hiding in a stove, but the story was already beginning to get attention outside of the apartment block, and they thought it would be best to go along and try to put an end to this whole thing before it got out of hand. The police arrived, and sure enough, they too heard the voice. In fact, it seemed to know who the police were, calling each officer by name as they stepped into the apartment. This seemed to be an increasingly common detail. The voice could see what was going on in the apartment at all times, which made it difficult to accept that this was simply someone else in the building, shouting into a vent. They stepped into the kitchen, and one of the officers decided to test the theory that whoever this was could see them. He flipped the light switch off. The voice shouted out for him to turn the light back on. He did so, and then the police began to speak to the voice in the stove, asking who it was, but they did not receive an answer. Then the police officer asked how many of them were in the room, and the voice gave the correct answer. The police, still convinced that this was simply the work of someone desperately trying to get attention, continued the conversation. "Do you want money?" they asked. "No," the voice shouted back with an aggressive tone. "Do you want a job?" "No." Again, it said in an even more gravelly voice than before. "Man, then what do you want?" "I am not a man," it responded, leading to a chilling silence between all those present in the kitchen. As creepy as the response was, the police still did not believe that anything supernatural was at play here. Instead, it was clear someone, somewhere in the building, was doing this. They began to assemble a team to investigate. In a documentary on the case, it was said they put together a team of intellectuals, but seemingly this was a combination of architects, engineers, and stonemasons who had constructed the original building. They then began to inspect the building from top to bottom, until they could find somewhere that the perpetrator could be hiding. All of the various ducts were inspected: the cellar, the attic, the roof, and even the cafe that occupied the ground floor. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone at all. All the while they searched, the voice could be heard, laughing, mocking, On one occasion, one of the investigators was in the kitchen, measuring the opening of the chimney. As he pulled out his tape measure, the voice responded that there was no need to measure. The opening was 75 centimeters wide. The man paused and then measured it anyway. The voice was correct. He was so freaked out that the mason left the apartment quickly and refused to return, leaving his tools behind and not coming back for them. By this point, the public had become very aware of the goings-on in the building. The newspapers were running updates on the case daily, but not just locally. The story was even picked up by the Times in London, which also published daily stories of what they were referring to as the polite Spanish ghost, as well as similar stories in the New York Times later on. Tourists even began to be bussed into the area. At times, thousands of people would show up on the street outside, all desperately trying to gain access to the building, or get close enough to hear the voice. On occasion, the crowds grew so large that the police couldn't handle them, prompting the local governor to station troops on the street to keep the peace. Some of the public came along almost as a joke, just seeing the whole thing as a bit of fun. There was an almost playful, carnival-like atmosphere to these visitors. Reports were made of people running around the nearby rooftops, wearing sheets over their heads and moaning. 6 separate people were arrested for this, although I can't imagine they were charged, unless there was a crime of impersonating a ghost at the time. Numerous people attempted to gain access to the building by pretending to be officials investigating the case. A radio station from Barcelona wanted to put a microphone in the kitchen to broadcast the goblin's messages, but they were denied access. But others saw it in a much more serious light, that something truly unexplainable was taking place in this building. Those people were separated into 2 camps. One half saw it as a miracle, a voice from beyond. Others saw it as something much more sinister, even demonic. This theory led to a priest being brought in to sprinkle holy water over the stove, but that seemingly did little to help the situation. According to a New York Times article from the period, several women in other apartments were somehow preemptively given the exorcism rites to avoid bewitchment. On one occasion, the owner of the building was in the Palazon family's apartment with several police officers and his youngest son, Arturo. Arturo actually became the last living known witness to this whole incident and was interviewed for a Spanish language documentary in the 2000s. He said by this point the building no longer felt like home. There were constant streams of people coming and going, and the police were stationed at all hours of the day, both inside and outside the building. It was getting late into the evening, and he was growing tired of the whole ordeal, just wanting to head back to his family's apartment. He turned to his dad and said, "Let's go, Dad. Let's go to sleep. This whole thing is crazy." That was when the voice spoke directly to him. In its deep voice it said, "Not crazy, little one." That was the last time Arturo said he heard the voice. He refused to go back to the apartment after this. The experience still haunted him well into his adult years. Even at this young age, he felt like this was something profoundly wrong. It felt like an interaction with something that should not be interacted with. With the increasing public awareness, there was also increasing pressure on the police to find a suspect and put this whole thing to bed. The governor was becoming more involved and was convinced that one of the supposed witnesses must be responsible. They began to bring in doctors and psychiatrists to speak with the residents of the building, one of whom was a well-respected psychiatrist named Joaquin Jimen Arriria, who seemed to quickly become fixated on the family's maid, Pascuala. The psychiatrist interviewed the entire family, but his conversations with Pasquale were referred to more as an interrogation. She was the first person to hear the voice beyond just the laughter. In his eyes, she was the most likely suspect behind this tall tale. After their conversation, Aurora decided that this was not a hoax, but that the maid was still responsible. He believed that she was hysterical, and as a result of this, was suffering from something he called unconscious ventriloquism. Unconscious ventriloquism is referred to as a psychological phenomenon in which a person produces speech sounds without consciously realizing they are the source. It's said that humans naturally have some ability to throw their voice, and under stress, emotional pressure, or even heightened suggestibility, this can happen unintentionally. It's suggested that this does not come out in the person's normal speaking voice. The voice may be whispered or produced deep in the throat, making it difficult for the brain to locate where the sound is coming from. In an echoing kitchen filled with hard surfaces and a metal stove, acting as a resonant chamber, a quiet or altered voice could easily seem as if it were coming from an object rather than a person. Crucially, according to this theory, the individual producing the sound may genuinely believe that the voice is external. Disassociation and social reinforcement can play a major role. And once others react with fear or surprise, the situation can quickly become a shared reality that reinforces the behaviour. However, it's worth pointing out that I could find very little on this phenomenon online. Most references to it seem to cycle back to the Zaragoza Goblin case, so I'm not sure that this is a widely proven phenomenon. It does, however, link us to another case we've covered before, that I'm sure we'll talk about later. According to one resident, as a test, Pasquale was sent away on an errand to a nearby lake to keep her away from the building for the day. However, the voice continued to talk. But still, the psychiatrist believed she was responsible. To quote from the New York Times article that came out later, "The girl was allowed to return home because it was stated she was quite unaware of her gift of ventriloquism, or that she had been impersonating the ghost. The examining magistrate declared that this was a genuine psychiatric phenomenon, produced only in certain circumstances, but he did not divulge what those circumstances are. Many spiritualists now maintain the girl was acting as a medium for some spirit, and there really was a ghost after all." The former occupant of the haunted apartment protests the investigation was not completed, and points out that the voice was heard on several occasions when the servant was absent from the kitchen. While they were trying to put this whole thing to bed by blaming the maid, many of the investigators were less convinced and proceeded with their investigation. This led the whole thing to take on a much more serious tone. The army was brought in to evacuate the residents. They cut all methods of communication to the building and guarded the entire area. The governor asked the media to play their part as well, demanding a full blackout of coverage of the events until the investigation was completed. The building was once again searched from top to bottom, and no sign of how this was being done could be found. A barrier had been set up around the entire property, meaning no one could enter without permission. The police finally reached the apartment and walked into the kitchen. During this search, the voice had not been heard, and the feeling was that this only reinforced the idea that one of the residents was responsible. One of the police officers called out, asking if it was still there. Then it began. A low, drawn-out cackle. It began to shout an endless stream of insults at the police, as though it had been holding all of this in, until they were willing to acknowledge it. Then it yelled a vicious threat, aimed at the Palazon family. It said, "I will kill them. All of them. But after that sudden outburst, there was silence once again. The police hung around, but after 48 hours of no activity, the residents were allowed back into the property, and the police withdrew. A number of residents gathered in the Palazon's kitchen to discuss whether it was truly over. Then they heard it. "Cowards," it yelled. "Cowards, here I am." It was mocking their attempts at getting help. There was no way, seemingly, to stop it. By December, and after a month of chaos on its streets, the governor put all the blame on the only suspect they had, Pasquale. The explanation of unconscious ventriloquism was put out as an official statement. Pasquale denied it, but very quickly she was portrayed as the villain in all of this, with many locals believing that she was behind the chaos the city had been facing over the past weeks. She was relieved of her duties and left Zaragoza. But reports of the activity had happened while she was away from the building, and reports were still made after she had left. Although due to the media quickly moving on, now that it had all been apparently debunked, very little information exists about these later instances. After 2 months of laughter, threats and taunts, the voice suddenly just one day stopped. No one was sure what had changed, what had caused it to leave, apparently never to be heard from again. The building was demolished many years ago, but in its place a new, more modern structure was built. A sign on the outside reads, "Duende," the name of this new building. A strange monument to an even stranger story. But it appears, at least, no further activity has been reported there. The residents were able to move on with their lives. It had been a strange period, but despite the at times violent threats coming from the voice, no one had been hurt or seriously affected. All except for Pasquale, who was apparently haunted by this story for the rest of her life. Despite moving away, people recognised her from the papers and constantly asked her about the goblin and her apparent, impressive ventriloquism skills. To begin with, she denied it over and over, but eventually she just gave up, becoming a recluse and living out her days alone. This 2-month incident had ruined her entire life. But many years later, a reporter was able to track her down, and to his surprise, was willing to give a short interview. When he asked where the voice had come from, she simply said, "The wall." So what really happened? This one is genuinely fascinating to me. Before we get too into it, let's just discuss the sources of where this information has come from. There are some great write-ups on this case, including from Atlas Obscura. Most of these articles seem to take their information from the Times of London, which provided daily English language updates on the case as it was playing out, but there are Spanish language news articles available. It's worth noting that the press was clearly having fun with this story, and while we shouldn't dismiss the events, they clearly are looking at it through a slightly comedic lens. There is also the more recently produced short documentary on the case that I will link in the description. This contains an interview with Arturo, the son of the building's owner, who was present for many of the events. Let's start with the official explanation, the unconscious ventriloquism of Pasquale. Where this becomes tricky is that we're dealing with second-hand information. Based on the story that is available to us, this official explanation seems ridiculous. How was this young girl laughing so loudly that it could be heard multiple floors away, to such an extreme that it made the residents leave their homes? How was she able to continue the voice, despite not being in the building? How did she develop such an incredible talent? But of course, we could be missing details here. Maybe the idea that she wasn't present at times was an invention by those interviewed at the time, and that has simply been treated as fact. Not that they were deliberately misleading the press, but just mistaken themselves. There are benefits to having so many witnesses, but at times that can make it harder to know which recountings are the most accurate. There may be details that we don't have, evidence that she was in fact responsible for all of this, but we can only go on the information available. And to me, this explanation doesn't feel all that convincing. From a skeptical side, I'm more inclined to believe the idea that this was someone outside of the home who was simply yelling into the chimney. But it's worth pointing out that there apparently wasn't an easy way to access the roof, and that the voice continued even after the authorities stationed guards and set up a perimeter surrounding it all, plus the fact that whoever it was could seemingly see into the apartment too. It's hard to believe that this prankster, or Pasquale, was able to convince all of these people for weeks without getting caught. But of course, not impossible. I'm sure many of you have already jumped to the case we've covered previously that echoes a lot of the events in Zaragoza, Jeff the Talking Mongoose. If you haven't listened to that episode, I strongly recommend it, as it's one of my favourite paranormal cases of all time. But it features another family being tormented by a spectral voice in their home, though in that case, they attribute it to a small furry creature rather than a goblin hidden in a chimney. Both cases centre on a disembodied voice that behaved less like a ghost and more like a mischievous personality living inside the home. The voice spoke conversationally, made jokes, insulted people, and reacted to daily events as though it were an unseen member of the household. In each story, the phenomenon became tightly tied to one specific location, turning an ordinary domestic space into the focus of intense attention from neighbours, journalists and investigators. The voices also seemed to become obsessed, specifically with the girls in both homes. At times protective, at times mocking and threatening. This case also seems to echo a lot of the weird jolts in the personality Jeff seemed to exhibit. But interestingly, the most common explanation for both cases was the idea of the young girls at the centre of them being exceptional ventriloquists, although in the Jeff case this was used to explain it as a more extravagant hoax rather than the Zaragoza case, where it was suggested that Pasquale was unaware she was the one behind it. There's interestingly a lack of other paranormal activity being reported in this one. It's pretty much just the voice. There are a few references to other strange noises, but nothing else. Some write-ups on this case refer to it as a poltergeist case, but I don't really see the connection there personally. I don't really know how to process this one. If the information we have is correct, then it is a genuinely baffling, unsolved mystery. But one that could be explained as being the work of a person, even if we don't quite know how they pulled it off. The building was searched extensively multiple times, suggesting this couldn't have been an audio device that someone had hidden, and no place that a human could be hiding was ever identified. So who, or what, was creating the voice? I'm genuinely quite stumped. So please do let me know your theories on this one in the comments. If it were a complete hoax, an example of an unstudied form of psychological phenomenon, or something else entirely, we may never know. But whatever took place in that apartment building captured the imagination of thousands, traumatized others, and left us with a truly bizarre mystery. That's all for this entry into the tape library. I hope you enjoyed this one. Despite being from the 1930s, this case seems to have had a bit of a resurgence recently. A number of you asked me to cover it in the last few months. I looked it up to see if it had been covered by another big show recently, but I couldn't really figure out where this sudden spike in interest had come from. I did see the podcasts Unexplained and This Paranormal Life had covered it in the last 6 months or so, but not many others. Either way, I'm really glad this was brought to my attention. I had never heard of it before, but the connections to Jeff were absolutely fascinating to me. I love that we're really starting to draw lines between cases on the show now, that so many patterns pop up time and time again in paranormal cases if you just look deep enough. This was probably one of the shortest episodes I've done in a long time, but I've always said I don't want to be constrained by a running time. Some cases have a lot of information that requires an hour or more to tell, others are more shorter. But I don't want to ignore really interesting cases like this, just because the episodes might be a bit short. Plans do tend to change, but my goal for the next one is likely going to be a bit of a longer episode, tackling a more modern paranormal tale. So if you want updates on when that will be out, please be sure to subscribe to the show, so you don't miss out. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.